coming up on Chopper's Politics.
But you're named after Labour leader Keir Hardie.
Yeah, you can't blame me for that, though. That was my mum and dad.
Well, I just wondered if you named any of your children Tony, Gordon, Ed or Jeremy.
Well, I haven't done, and I wouldn't do.
Well, you wait for 5 years for an interview with a Labour leader, and then 2 come along. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. My guest this week is Sir Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition. Now, you might be able to hear some of his family in the background during this interview. Well, that's the perils of working from home, isn't it? I spoke to Sir Keir on Wednesday night remotely after a Prime Minister's questions where care homes were back on the agenda, as well as track and tracing. He also raised the issue of why migrant workers are paying to use the NHS, prompting a U-turn from the government just 24 hours later. But even now, the big pressing topic of the week in the world of COVID-19 and Westminster is, can primary schools in England reopen on June the 1st, with teaching unions pushing the government to try and delay that date until they're happy it will be safe. So how has he found his first few weeks as Labour leader during these unprecedented times? Let's find out. Keir Starmer, welcome to Chopper's Politics. How are you?
Very good. It's great to be back, Chris, in a slightly new capacity as leader of the Labour Party, which is a huge privilege. But it's nice to be back. It's been a while.
It certainly has. I was sitting above you watching your grilling of Boris today, and it struck me as very like a silent courtroom, and you're like Columbo or Ironside or someone just grilling this witness. Is that how it feels to you? It's so quiet.
It does feel very different, I have to say. There are so many things that are different. I mean, I started off the campaign to become leader of the Labour Party by dashing around the country, trying to see as many people as possible, and ended up 3 months later doing my sort of the first time I got to speak to the nation was on the day I got elected in as Labour leader, and I had to do that speech in my living room with a camera and a microphone. Yes. But equally, I think all of us assume PMQs, leader of the opposition, and there'll be a lot of noise, particularly the early ones, when, frankly, there'll be a lot of Tories trying to put you off your pace. So we're now in this arena, which is much quieter. What I would say is the number of people who've contacted me to say this is so much better because you can actually put questions and get answers. So for a lot of people, it's a lot more refreshing because I think however much we like the rough and tumble of PMQs, for most of the public, they're pretty turned off by it.
Yes, it does allow for this kind of forensic style of questioning. And I could hear Boris Johnson coming back to you saying, you said you hadn't answered my question. He said, I have answered it. You can hear all the off-mic bits.
Yeah, well, that's all very odd and was particularly odd today because I was merely at that point putting to the Prime Minister what the Chief Executive of Care England had actually said in evidence at a select committee. So to get him saying under his breath, no, he didn't, was interesting. But yes. It is interesting because you can hear what anybody says. And can you hear all that from a gallery?
Yes, I could, yeah, right above you. So it's quite extraordinary. I have noticed, though, you are using Telegraph articles when you needle him. Is that a sort of a way of almost trolling him in PMQs?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. What I'm keen to do is to be absolutely clear that the Labour Party is a party that wants to appeal very broadly across the whole population. And that's why I've been very interested in doing things with the Telegraph. We did a fantastic piece on VE Day about care homes. And I think it's very, very important for the Labour Party to be clear about reaching out, wanting to reach all sections of society. And I absolutely understand that my role as leader of the Labour Party is to make sure the Labour Party re-engages, if you like, sometimes engaged for the first time, with lots of people. Frankly, whichever way they vote, there's a conversation to be had, particularly in a time of crisis. I think last week I did put the Telegraph piece. It was the rather moving example from the cardiologist of his description of what he thought had happened in care homes, which I thought was very powerful.
Yes, it was. And also you used the care home story about NHS deploying patients back into care homes, and that was part of it.
Yeah.
Do you think the PM has had it easy, do you think, with Jeremy Corbyn when he was doing it? Because he often stuck to a script which was less inquisitorial.
I think that, it's no secret that Jeremy and I have got very different styles on a number of fronts. I like to have the detail. I like to have the evidence to back it up, and by and large, I like to be able to react to what the Prime Minister is saying or whoever it is saying. Jeremy did PMQs in a different way, but then, we've done other things in different ways. I'm doing these Call Keir meetings across the country where I go and have meetings. I mean, at the moment they're virtual, but I want them to be real. But every Thursday I do 2 meetings in different parts of the country. So we went to Bury virtually, and then we went to Tees Valley, then we went to Scotland, and then to Wrexham and Bridgend. And what I've asked for there, and I'll do this physically when I can, and Chris, you can come along with us, is I've said I want people from the locality to come to a meeting, but I don't want Labour supporters and Labour voters to be the only people in the audience. I actually want people who are not Labour voters, and I want them to challenge me and be frank with me and be blunt with me. So my preference is to speak to those people rather than to go around the country, having rallies of Labour members and supporters. I mean, it's a shame they're by Zoom, but they're very local, and I'm literally saying to people, be blunt, be frank. What does the Labour Party need to do, in your view, to reconnect and re-engage? They're fascinating and really important.
Did Jeremy Corbyn give you any advice when he stood down? Didn't leave you a note on the desk, did he, in the office of...
There was no note in the desk, but I did speak to all of the Labour leaders on the day I got to become leader of the Labour Party. And they all obviously gave me advice, not all of it consistent with each other, but it was good to talk to them all. But he didn't leave a note, no.
No, you're trying to be constructive. Are you getting that balance right? I mean, if you were faced with those same challenges that Boris Johnson's faced, would you have done something different? Would you have put money into PPE or into more testing and less into these new Nightingale hospitals?
Well, look, I think the first thing is to honestly acknowledge that dealing with this crisis would be a challenge for any government. And there's no pretending that a different government would have made all the right decisions. It is really challenging. And what I've said is that we'll be a constructive opposition with the courage to say whether the government's getting it right and to support them in it. And so on lockdown and the conditions of lockdown, we've been absolutely full square with the government. I've spoken to the Prime Minister 3 or 4 times now and said that we will stand with them on that. But to challenge them where we think they're getting it wrong or going too slowly. And the point of the challenge is to rectify mistakes or to speed things up. So if you take testing or PPE, where we've challenged quite hard, the point of that is to get the testing ramped up. The point of that is to get the PPE to the right place on the front line. I do think that the government's been slow. I think it was slow into the lockdown. I think it was slow on testing, slow on PPE. Slow on smaller things, like there were a number of British businesses that got in touch with the government to say we could do some protective equipment, and many of them didn't get a reply. So I do think this slow to react is a theme of the government. And I do think even now on testing and tracing in particular, they're behind the curve. And, people will say, well, that's just, criticising. But actually, test, trace and isolate is critical, because what everybody wants to avoid is a second peak. And as we relax, the only way we're going to get the balance right is if we're able to track very, very quickly any outbreaks of coronavirus. So what's being said now about this is massively important. And I think the government should just dial down the rhetoric. We don't need a world-beating test, trace and track. We just need a very effective one. And given that Germany and South Korea are way ahead of us in many respects, world beating doesn't have any meaning. But insofar as they want an effective system there, I would support them in that. Insofar as they want, more children to be able to go back to school, well, I want that and, would work with them on that. So there are areas where we'd work with them, but I do think they've been slow.
On schools, would you send your children back to school in this current environment?
Chris, at the moment, my children are at school because my wife works for the NHS and therefore she's a key worker. So she's in 5 days a week. So our children have been in school throughout. And it's a reminder that this perception that schools are shut at the moment and the question is whether we open them is wrong. They're open at the moment. Teachers, staff are on the front line every day. The question is, can we increase the numbers of children going back into school? And I want that to happen as soon as it can. But of course, it's got to be safe. And I think in a sense, the task of the Prime Minister is to build the consensus to give people confidence. Most of the polling I've seen, and the Telegraph may have done some polling, I haven't seen it, show that parents are about 50-50. They're genuinely worried. And you can see different councils saying, well, we're not against opening, but whether we can do it on the 1st of June is a big ask. I just think that rather than accentuating the differences here, the Prime Minister should pull a task force together and say, right, we're going to lead from the front here. And if we can get a consensus, we will give people confidence, because what people need more than anything at the moment is confidence. I do want those, I want as many children to go back as soon as possible. It'll have to be phased. Inevitably, and there'll have to be safety rules in place. But I think if everybody pulled together, we could get there.
Don't you think, though, that, from some Telegraph correspondence we're getting, that it looks like the sort of left-wing teachers' unions are holding these schools to ransom? I mean, don't you think they should be told by someone like you in your position? I mean, in many ways, Neil Kinnock had his challenge with the National Union of Mine Workers back in the 80s, and he ducked that one. This could be your chance to say to the unions, come on, let's get the national interest first, let's get these schools back in, and but safely.
Well, I mean, I've been speaking to the unions, as you would expect. I've been speaking to parents and to local authorities, and there's no doubt there are levels of concerns. And I want us all to work together to get the schools back open. And actually, that's what the teaching unions want as well, because the idea that at the moment in lockdown, all children are safe and the only risk to their safety is if they go back to school is wrong, because some children are at risk whilst we're in lockdown, particularly children who are at risk at home, are vulnerable. Although schools are open for vulnerable children, not all vulnerable children are in. So I don't actually see this as an issue where you can point to one group that are holding everybody else up. I was very struck last night that Solihull Council, a Conservative council, came out and said, yes, we don't think we can make the first. And I don't criticise them because they're Conservative on that. I mean, I just take it at face value. Here's a local authority that's saying, actually, we don't think we can do the 1st of June. And the one thing that we don't want is a second spike. And therefore, these are not unreasonable conversations to have as to how do we make sure the risk is managed. You'll never really be able to get a school to comply with social distancing all the time, particularly with young children. But I think it would give confidence to people if there was a consensus. And I actually think that if the Prime Minister said, I'll set up a task force, teaching unions, parents, local authorities, government, everybody else who needs to be around the table, put your shoulder to the wheel, let's get on with this, I would certainly support that.
Do you back the NEU's 5 tests then to get back, or do you think they're a bit too difficult to hit?
I think they're perfectly reasonable tests. We can't have tests that can't be hit. I think they're tests that can be met. And I think if everybody pulled together, we would find a way to get children back into schools, which is what I think everybody wants.
I know you've got to bring in the children as you see fit, but if your children are able to go to school and others can't, is it hard for you to understand how hard it can be having children at home and trying to homeschool them and do a job? It's okay if you can send your kids to school like you can, but others can't.
Oh, I think it's very difficult. Everybody is struggling with homeschooling. And of course, homeschooling is much easier if you've got space and lots of devices in your house, much more difficult if you're in overcrowded accommodation and you haven't got devices. So I completely understand that. I am also concerned that at the moment, there are vulnerable children who aren't in school and need to be. And the sooner that happens, the better. I mean, we've got to think slightly broader on this, because what the government's proposing is that certain year groups go back, which I completely understand. But that means that if you're not in that year group and you're vulnerable, you may still be at home. And we need to address that question. And of course, the government's indicating that parents won't be fined for not sending their children to school. And so it's quite conceivable that vulnerable children won't necessarily go in. So I think this is why we need a task force to get to grips with all of the elements here. I actually think with goodwill, this could be pulled off. And I would certainly pull together with all the relevant players, including the government, to play my part in that.
Right, stay with me. I'll be talking to the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, about anti-Semitism and why he prefers being called Keir, not Sir Keir, and how he thinks the era of Leave and Remain is basically over. Right after this.
Go beyond the headlines with the Telegraph's daily coronavirus podcast, a roundup of the latest news on the pandemic from our leading journalists, with analysis on the impact on health, business and travel every weekday evening. Search Coronavirus the Latest on your podcast app.
Right, we're back on the podcast with Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition. Do you think things like this 2-metre rule should be relaxed so it could allow for more people on trains, more people in classrooms? Are you happy with the way it's been run by the science?
Well, I would stick with the 2-metre rule unless and until the government and their advisors say otherwise. So this is an area where I don't think it's helpful for the opposition to run a sort of rival set of rules. I genuinely think the government's put in 2 metres because that's the advice that it's got. I wouldn't want to undermine that. But it does make life difficult because on transport, if you're going to run a 2-metre rule, then you can only have a small percentage of usual travellers on the network. And that's a struggle.
The big issue we have at the Telegraph is who's going to pay for this. We know about the Labour manifesto, which wasn't your manifesto at the last election. But would you look to increase taxes? Anyone earning under £85,000 wouldn't pay any extra income tax or NICs. Is that what you'd stick to if you were in government now?
Well, Chris, trying to do economic policy at this stage when we don't know the extent of the damage to the economy is the devil's own game. But I think let's not make the mistakes of 2010 to 2020, that decade of austerity, which has left our public services underfunded, has affected our resilience, and in my view has increased inequality in quite a profound way. We don't yet know what the damage to the economy is, and I don't think it's therefore sensible or possible to say, in which bracket would the percentage of tax be X, Y, or Z. But the broad principle that those with the broadest shoulders should contribute more is one that I think the vast majority of people subscribe to. It's got to be balanced, it's got to be reasonable, but it's that principle has been, the backbone of economic thinking for quite some time.
So you back the PM on his anti-austerity message from last week?
Well, yeah, I'd be interested to know exactly how he intends to square this circle. And we've got a PM who says a lot of things that don't, in the end up in the way that he said. I remember him at the dispatch box saying in absolutely clear terms that there would be no checks for anything travelling between GB and Northern Ireland. And this week we've seen exactly that. So I'm afraid I take everything Boris Johnson says with a pinch of salt.
He is saying we're leaving the EU on the 31st of December. If we leave on the 31st of December, will you then accept that?
Well, we've left.
I know. I mean, getting out of the transition period, of course.
No, but it is an important point for me, Chris, to be clear on, because we've left the EU and therefore the Leave Remain argument is over. And the only argument now is what sort of a deal we have with the EU and what sort of deals we have with the rest of the world. Now, I want us to have a deal with the EU because I think there are real dangers in a no-deal Brexit. But as I say, the Leave Remain argument is over. And I was very clear in my leadership campaign about that because I think it's very important for the Labour Party to be clear that whatever position we and others may have taken in the last 3.5, getting on for 4 years, that divide between Leave and Remain is now over.
Would you ever entertain rejoining the EU if you became Prime Minister?
I don't think there's a case for rejoining the EU, and I'm certainly not making that case.
What do you say to the millions of Labour supporters who felt betrayed by the Brexit position of the Labour Party at the last election?
Well, we've done a lot of work on why people didn't vote Labour at the last election. We've done polling, we've done focus groups. We know what we were picking up on the ground. The readout from that is pretty consistent, which is that there are 3 or 4 main reasons. The one that came up most was the leadership of the Labour Party. Now, I always qualify that by saying fairly or unfairly, because Jeremy took a lot of attacks from the media in the election and throughout his time as Labour leader. Brexit came up. I absolutely don't deny that. It came up in different ways in different parts of the country. So it came up in particular ways in the Midlands and the North East and North West, came up differently in Scotland, obviously. And the overload of the manifesto came up, where people weren't so much saying, we don't like any of your policies. They were just saying there's too many of them and we don't think they're deliverable. On the specific question of Brexit, one of the reasons I'm doing the Cool Keir meetings and going and talking directly to people is because I want to go and talk to areas that we lost. So that's why I went to Bury and to Tees Valley, etc., and have conversations with people about why we lost. Part of that's about Brexit. But when I was Brexit Secretary or Shadow Brexit Secretary, I did go to a place that voted Leave a lot to have conversations. And once we got beyond the sort of basic divide of, are you for or against the EU, there was a lot of common ground on people wanting to have more control over their own lives, investment in their region, and a sense of being involved and able to influence what happens, which I think is very powerful.
Do you fear a no-deal Brexit now?
I certainly hope we don't end up with a no-deal Brexit. I don't think a no-deal Brexit on top of the economic problems we're having as a result of this crisis is what anybody could possibly want.
Which previous Labour leader do you closely identify with?
Well, I keep being asked this, and I always say Attlee, but when we did one of the hustings, they said we couldn't go back to Attlee, so we had to choose somebody else. And I chose Wilson. I'm quite reluctant to do this. Which Labour leader do you most admire? Because for the Labour Party, I'm really clear. The next 4 years is a period in which we've got to do a huge amount of work. We've got a mountain to climb. There's no pretending otherwise. And we, the team in place now, and along with our members and our movement, have got to do that hard work. And so we're going to be defined not by some past Labour leader. We're going to be defined by what we do over the next 4 years and whether we can climb that mountain. And so I don't look to cling to any past Labour leader. I learned from all of them, but I am not any of them.
But you're named after Labour leader Keir Hardie.
Yeah, you can't blame me for that, though. That was my mum and dad.
Well, I just wondered if you named any of your children Tony, Gordon, Ed or Jeremy.
Well, I haven't done, and I wouldn't do. But my mum and dad were proud supporters of Labour, and, it was a fantastic thing that they did call me Keir, but I can't claim any credit for that.
I've got to ask you about anti-Semitism and how that dogged the party under Jeremy Corbyn. How will you get past that? I know you're very keen to. And what moves will you do to deal with that?
Well, the first thing is, I think it's very much a leadership issue. And what the leader of the Labour Party says and does really, really matters. And that's why I was very determined in my first address, my first action as Labour leader, to apologise for what's gone on in absolutely clear terms, because notwithstanding the coronavirus, I thought it was so important for our party to be clear that we will tear out anti-Semitism, which is why I said that in my first speech. Within hours of becoming Labour leader on the 4th of April, I had telephoned all of the leaders of the Jewish communities to ask them if they would meet me so that we could discuss how we could move forward. They all said yes, and I've had a meeting with all of them. I did that within the first week. I had a good meeting with JLM, the Labour-affiliated movement, yesterday. And, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think we've started on the journey. There's much more to be done. That involves, what we do with the disciplinary cases, but it's about the culture of the party and the values of the party. I want us to root out and tackle anti-Semitism, not so that we get more votes, but actually because the values and principles of the Labour Party require us to do it. And I'm absolutely determined we're going to do it.
What's your target? To have got through those cases by the end of next year, by the end of this year?
Well, in a sense, the cases need to move much more quickly. We need to be much more effective. But that isn't the test. I don't want a Labour Party that's just got an effective mechanism for dealing with anti-Semitism. I want a Labour Party that hasn't got anti-Semitism in it. So it's more fundamental. Being able to dispatch the cases efficiently is, of course, a good thing. But that's not the badge of a changed Labour Party. The badge of a changed Labour Party is a Labour Party where if you're anti-Semitic, you're not in the Labour Party.
You gave a front bench job to Ed Miliband. Did Jeremy Corbyn not want one?
Ed has a huge amount to offer and is already beginning to make his mark in the role that he's doing in the shadow cabinet. So it's really valuable to have him in the team. Jeremy is, a friend. I respect Jeremy, and I worked well with Jeremy when he was leader of the Labour Party. But he is now a backbencher.
OK. You're a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, but you don't want to be called a Sir. Why is that? Because I know Mrs. Hope would love to be a lady, for example.
To be honest, look, I've never been a big one for titles. I mean, I got that knighthood for services to law and criminal justice, partly for being the Director of Public Prosecutions, partly for wider services to the law. And I'm really proud about that. And my family are really proud about that. And my staff at the CPS were very proud about that. But I just don't particularly like titles. You remember, Chris, when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I asked the staff, because it was ingrained in Crown Prosecution Service staff to call the Director of Public Prosecutions director. So I said, don't call me director, call me Keir. So this is not actually to do with the knighthood. It's just that Keir has served me very, very well in my life, and I much prefer it. And I think people, it's a difficult thing for people if they think they've got to call you by a particular title. I just prefer people to call me Keir, but it's not to do with the knighthood. I was exactly the same with the DPP title.
Is Labour a patriotic party? I asked that question because there's a real nervousness about the party amongst Telegraph readers and listeners to this podcast, the way that Jeremy Corbyn was a Republican and would he bow for the Queen or kneel for the Queen. Those things matter to them. Do you think that you can make Labour into a patriotic party again?
Yeah, we are a patriotic party, and I'm proud to be patriotic. And, I want to lead the Labour Party because I want a Labour government that can change our country for the better. There's no deeper sense of patriotism than that. So I'm proud that we're patriotic. I don't think we should be shy about it. I think it is something we should be very proud of. And I think, the fact that thousands and thousands of activists give up their free time to try and improve our country is a real reflection of just how patriotic they are. It's also why we wanted to make clear our appreciation on VE Day of those that came before us and gave so much during the Second World War.
And things like state banquets, you'll be going to those. If Donald Trump came over, would you go to his state banquet?
Well, look, I don't know when he's coming over, not anytime soon. With the election in November may happen before then. But, I've never shied away from these events. I've attended them when I was Director of Public Prosecutions. No doubt I'll attend them as leader of the Labour Party. For me, getting on with the job, making sure that the Labour Party reconnects, re-engages with the electorate, and not just the electorate that traditionally votes Labour. I want to have those conversations with the whole of the electorate. It doesn't mean everybody will agree with us all of the time, but I think the starting position should be to have that discussion with anyone who's prepared to have that discussion with us.
Well, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, thank you so much for joining us on Choppers Politics. It's been great fun, and we'll have you on again. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be on.
Well, that's it for this week. What struck me there was what Sir Keir Starmer said about the task force he's proposing to try to tackle the thorny issue of schools reopening in England from Monday week, and how he might try and reach a consensus between government, teaching unions, councils, and crucially, parents. And of course, the fact that in his mind, the era of leave versus remain is over, and if he's elected Prime Minister, he will not try and rejoin the EU. That message will not be lost on lots of listeners to this podcast. Thank you to our guest, Sir Keir Starmer. And thank you to my producers, Elliot Lampitt, Louisa Wells and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for taking the time to listen to Choppers Politics and providing us with some very canny questions. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. And don't forget, if you work for the NHS, you can get a free 6-month digital subscription to the Telegraph as our small way of saying thank you for being basically wonderful. And details of that offer are in the show notes for this episode. Everyone else can get 30 days free access to Telegraph's content by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. Until next time, cheerio!